The Soviet Navy, Imperial Russian Navy, is something we've discussed on this channel at length. From their eccentric torpedo battleship ideas to massive battleship carrier hybrids or their completed battleships like the Ganget or Empress Maria classes and their shortcomings. It's safe to say Russian and especially Soviet ship construction was lacking, and I think no better class illustrates this than the Leningrad-Minsk class of Soviet destroyer flotilla leaders. In today's video, we'll discuss the problems with Soviet construction this class of ships, especially the weakness of their construction. Before we get into the details of their design and construction, I think it's important to discuss the quality of Soviet ship construction and the lack thereof, especially in this, the first real class of combat ships built following the revolution. In Warships of the Soviet Fleet, 1939 to 1945, Volume 1. Nature combatants, these fine gentlemen, discuss this subject, and they open with this. The creation of a warship, like most sophisticated engineering products, is a process requiring balance, cooperation, and exchange of information between all participants in the process. The most important actors in this process are the naval authority, in effect, the purchaser, the ship design team, designer, shipyard, and suppliers of components, builder, and the Navy operator, significantly simplifying this matter to build one product ship. It is possible to treat the process as linear. The role of purchaser is to specify the requirements of the product. The role of designer is to prepare the design to be assembled by the builder from available components. And finally, the role of operator is to run the product. In practice, a far greater degree of information exchange and multi-directed interactions are necessary between all the actors during the whole process. They go on to describe how other navies view this exchange of ideas and material, and then they get into the first Soviet warships. The first Soviet warships were children of their time. The purchaser was experiencing a moment of great instability in Soviet war doctrine, particularly regarding the role of the Navy. It was shaped by a generation of revolutionary military commanders with little or no naval experience. Most influential was Stalin himself. Forced through his ideas unsupported by any sound knowledge except from the brochure on naval matters prepared for him by Krylov. The party and the military leaders could not accept that the law of physics applied everywhere, even in the Soviet Union, and persistently demanded ships smaller but better armed than contemporaries. From the perspective of Soviet designers, the baseline standard was not of the highest quality, as Russian naval shipbuilding generally lagged behind developments of other naval powers in the 20th century. Almost all experience was not first-rate, but due to the revolution, it was not only evaporated, but was practically annihilated. All the shipyards were nationalized and looted. Technical documentation vanished. Most of the engineering staff were mobilized or fled into the countryside to avoid starvation or immigrated to avoid persecution because of their education. They were viewed as part of the elites. The few who were left were faced with the task of implementing hugely unrealistic requirements in terms of staff and designs, given the fact that the designers were new and inexperienced. For example, Vladimir Nikitin, a former artillery officer who would direct the design of the first surface warships in 1926, graduated from the shipbuilding faculty the previous year. It also didn't help the fact that the designers also worked in what today we might call a hostile work environment. Taking from Soviet warships, the designers worked in an atmosphere of growing terror at a time of draconian punishments for trivial offenses. Industry managerial staff worked in the shadow of the Shakti trial of 1928, and all design decisions had to be made under this threatening cloud. As a result, the ships were designed in a chaotic environment, characterized by contrast changes of policy and organization. From the perspective of the builders, the shipbuilding industry had to be completely rebuilt from 1927, on after 10 years in which no new experience of ship construction had been accumulated. This was the period during which Stalin assumed absolute power in the Soviet Union, a period marked by terror, the progressive militarization of society, and forced industrialization and rearmament to which the entire economy of the Soviet Union was forced to bow to. This was done in an uncoordinated manner with tensions and imbalances everywhere, especially in the shipbuilding arena. Coupled with these problems were technological backwardness, low cultural capital, and work ethic that had been completely destroyed by their working conditions. The ambitious production plans drawn up by Soviet leaders often fell short of their mark. Shipbuilders faced these issues and many more, and especially of actually producing their components for the ships correctly. Where, for example, for the destroyer leader Minsk, her steam valve box had to be not cast once, not twice, not 3 times, but 46 times before satisfactory results were actually achieved. These issues, combined with the problems with the installation of components, led to delays in their completion. An interesting report comes from a group of U.S. Navy officers headed by Rear Admiral Clarence Olson, in which they visited the destroyer Razuna at Polarini in January 1944. Commander Kemp Tolley made the following remarks about the destroyers in an intelligence report. The ship was inferior in every respect to a contemporary American vessel. Technical development is far behind that to be found in the major navies. Effectiveness in battle would be no greater than that of a World War I type U.S. destroyer. Design is not good, and there seems to be little understanding of construction measures to reduce fire hazards. Artillery was far from modern installation. I think you get the picture. In future videos, we'll dig into this a little bit more, especially in a future video on the Leningrad-Class cruisers. I just wanted to give you all a little preview of the Leningrad-Class and some of the issues they'll face in their careers. Minsk-class development. The issue with casting of the Minsk steam valve box was certainly an interesting issue. Yet, there were so many more with this class. I think that comes with the territory these ships came in. They were one of the first combat ships designed and built by the USSR after the end of the Civil War, and after those issues we discussed previously, it's easy to see why there were problems. Anyway, work began in 1925 with the powers that be formulating requirements ranging from ships of a small cruiser size with 4 183mm guns to fast ships with guns of 100mm and speed adequate for a torpedo attack. At some stages carrying a seaplane. The final design, which was Design 1, was heavily influenced by the large French and Italian destroyers being built, such as the Jaguar-class for France and the Capitan Romani-class for the Italians, with some calling those light cruisers. Not important to our story, though. In Soviet Destroyers of World War II by Alexander Hill, he writes, in plans of the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Leningrad-Class or Project 2 and the older Novik-class brethren of World War I vintage were to be led and supported by a series of new Soviet-manufactured destroyer or flotille leaders conceived as early as 1928. The development of the Project 1 design for such vessels began in earnest in September 1930, and by February 1932, the aim was to produce vessels with a normal displacement of 2,250 tons, with an impressive maximum speed of 40½ knots. Given the lack of experience of Soviet industry in the construction of modern warships and the pressure for rapid results, this maximum speed was an ambitious goal. Not only the boilers and turbines had to be developed for the destroyer leaders, but also new armament, even if it was to be based on Tsarist-era weapons. An interesting point at the end about Tsarist-era weaponry, as well as the wool of these ships, being larger vessels meant to weed other destroyers or torpedo boats, a concept that is touched on in Tribals, Battles, and Darings, the genesis of the modern destroyer by the good Dr. Alexander Clark. He writes about the London Naval Treaty and its provisions for destroyer leaders. Whilst other destroyers were limited to 1,500 tons, each signatory was permitted to use 16% of their total allowed destroyer tonnage for vessels up to 1,850 tons. Theoretically, these larger ships would act as flag vessels, the leader for each destroyer flotilla. At least, that is what had been stated at the conferences which first produced the treaties. Although not an apples-to-apples comparison, I felt it was a good explanation for the role the Soviets thought these destroyers might play in their fleet. Of course, I should mention that Soviets did not abide by the interwar naval treaties, and anytime I can quote Dr. Clark, I will. Development of the destroyers came relatively fast, with the first destroyers being laid down by 1932, these being the first series of ships, Leningrad, Moskva, and Kharkov, 2 for the Black Sea and only 1 for the Baltic. Their completion was delayed by their new armament, the 130mm 50 caliber B-13 gun, which itself had been delayed with the main guns being fitted to Leningrad in August of 1935 while she was launched. In 1933, even before the prototypes were tested on proving grounds, there were other issues with the ships which showed on their trials. Taking from Soviet warships, quality of workmanship was inferior. With poor hull construction, the hull forward later proved prone to damage and heavy weather. On trials, the ships exceeded 43 knots, but at high speeds, heavy vibration was pressed down. The propellers cavitated badly when speeds exceeded 36 knots, while at low speeds, the ship steered badly. While Hill writes, in the end, during state trials before the handover of the vessel to the Navy on November 5, 1936, the then 2,225-ton Leningrad managed an impressive 43 knots in calm waters. Impressive as the speed was, many flaws in the design and construction soon became apparent. Lifting of the bow, even with extra forward ballast, was dangerously severe. Lifting of the bow was a serious impediment to firing the main armament and considerable vibration at high speeds, as well as the fact that the hull was too weak to allow the main guns to be all fired at once, were also major issues. The vessel was difficult to steer at cruising speeds of 30 knots, and even at lower speeds, comparing unfavorably in this regard to the Leningrad-Class vessels. And there were also issues with maintaining the performance of the boilers during operational use. So it's safe to say there were some issues with the first run of ships, and just so we're clear here are their particulars as found in Soviet warships, and here are their particulars as found in Alexander Hill's book, Improvements. The Soviets took steps to attempt to improve the vessels with the ships after the first series being built to an improved design with fuller stern lines, but neither design proved successful. Seeping was poor and fighting capabilities were seriously reduced from a sea state of 4 and upwards, which is a moderate sea with waves between 1.2 meters and 2.5 meters. The capabilities of the ship were further reduced when the ship roll exceeded 10 degrees. The torpedo armament was useless, and the rate of fire of the main battery fell off rapidly. Another thing I should touch on is the build time of these vessels, with some of them taking up to 6 years to be completed, which is something akin to battleship construction of the French in the late 19th century. While other destroyer leaders, such as the Tribal class of Britain taking only 2 years to complete, were the Jaguar class of France taking a similar amount of time. But getting back to our Soviet vessels, another contributing factor was the political climate of the 1930s in the Soviet Union, with people of the Navy getting purged quite frequently, causing the issues with the vessels to be overlooked somewhat, with the Leningrad, for example, being accepted into Soviet service in December 1936, the day of the introduction of the Stalin Constitution. The chair of the Acceptance Commission described the Leningrad as ending up being very much a modern vessel with good running and seeping qualities. So much so that she sat in factory number 190 until July 1938, while they tried to work out her various defects, or at least to mitigate them. As I previously mentioned, the second series, Minsk, Arkhaniki, the Exkev or Kiev, and Tis were supposed to be improvements of the first series design, with the designers and constructors attempting to give them more reliable power systems and seeping qualities, with Minsk even receiving a modified bow. The changes were relatively minor and far from solving the problems of the basic design. Each of the ships were finally completed by 1940, just in time for the Soviet entry into the Second World War. The destroyers performed roles many other Soviet ships did during the war, participating in bombardments and evacuations of refugees and soldiers to safer locations as Axis forces advanced. 2 of the class were lost during the war. The Moskva, possibly to a Soviet submarine, and the Kharkov by German air attack. The surviving destroyers and some of the ones that were sunk had modifications to their armaments, mainly to their anti-aircraft battery throughout their careers, and especially during the Second World War. After the war, the destroyers were used in various roles, with some being expended during missile testing in the 1960s. Conclusion: This class of destroyers is certainly not the best, but I think it's important to look at the context the ships were built in, and how difficult it must have been to design and construct these vessels, having to start essentially from scratch. In any case, thank you all for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.